freedom, oh, freedom, oh, freedom over me.
Dr. Martin Luther King stated back in the 60s, 11 o'clock Sunday morning is the most segregated hour in the Christian church in America.
To my Lord and be free, oh, freedom.
When I was growing up, my first choral experience was in the United Methodist Church in High Point, North Carolina. It was a confusing place. It was clear that there were racist themes, and yet you're learning in church. God loves all of us, as we are, all of us.
I'll be buried in my own grave. And go home to my Lord.
Well, I think the value of the spiritual in today's society really is that it is part of our American story, first of all. So it's part of the tapestry of what makes America unique. And it's part of looking at our history with, real eyes. We're not trying to avoid the story. We're going to look at it sort of head on, accept what transpired, and see where we can move from there.
I think that a chorus like Cathedral Choral Society that has such significant history, and frankly, a chorus that has resources, has almost a responsibility to delve deeper into the American choral tradition, and specifically the choral music of Black Americans.
Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom.
My name is Stephen Fox. I'm music director of Cathedral Choral Society. I grew up in New York City and went to Horace Mann School. Horace Mann had a great music program, so I was really fortunate to start singing and playing instruments at a relatively young age. My father was actually an early rock and roll musician. He was part of a doo-wop group that was called Norman Fox and the Rob Roys. He was the lead singer. He started that group when he was 17 years old, and it was actually the first interracial doo-wop group, first interracial early rock and roll group to form.
I'm Stanleythurston, the founder and artistic director of the Heritage Signature Chorale. I grew up in Chicago, and mostly I remember the public school program of music in Chicago. There were lots of opportunities to be involved in music, after school programs, the all-city programs. I remember particularly all-city high school choir. We had a director who was a member of the Chicago Symphony Chorus at the time when Margaret Hillis was the director. Pretty much sacred music was in our house. My dad was a pastor, so we didn't listen to too much secular music. Of course, in the radio and school, we were Ohio players, Earth, Wind and Fire, Stevie Wonder. I did start listening to jazz in high school and was fascinated with Ramsey Lewis as a pianist.
My name is Albert Benjamin Spencer Jr., and I go by the nickname of Benji. Been called Benji since 10th grade. Grew up in Portsmouth, Virginia during the 60s, right there during the Civil Rights era. My father loved music. He did jazz, classical, R&B, soul, country and western. And believe it or not, one of his favorite genre music was John Philip Sousa. And probably what kind of drove that was he was in the Navy. He actually served in World War II. And so he had a lot of respect for the service. And so we always had music in the house. I think that was great because it allowed me to have an appreciation of the various genres of music, even at a young age.
My name is Susan Stanford. I have sung in Cathedral Choral Society for 10 years. I grew up in the 1960s in High Point, North Carolina. The South was A slow, genial, happy place. In those years, it was very much like Eisenhower's 1950s. My first choral experience was in the church I grew up in. I was in children's choir. All the children in my family sang in children's choir. When I was growing up, the house was full of music always. My mother played piano. My mother taught piano. My mother had wonderful songbooks, the Roaring Twenties, songs from the 30s, the 40s, and we stood at the piano and sang those songs, crazy songs. My parents bought Beatles albums. In the 1960s, we heard the brand new Beatles albums as they came out. It was amazing.
My parents had a broadcast. A lot of the churches would broadcast their service, and we were one of the ones that had a broadcast. So a lot of famous singers would actually come by the church because that's where they could get on the radio. Albertina Walker, the Caravans, Shirley Caesar, Mahalia Jackson. Actually, the organist at our church was one that played for Mahalia Jackson, which he did a lot of her recordings.
So my first introduction to singing really was singing in the church choir. In junior high school, myself and two of my best friends, whose voices dropped around about the same time, we started singing in the young adult choir while we were in junior high school because they needed more bass voices. So I came up singing spirituals and anthems in the Presbyterian church.
My father and my sister would get me to sing sometimes with them. My sister played the piano in our apartment, and I would sometimes improvise on the saxophone with her, and sometimes I would sing along with her. So my parents noticed that I liked to sing, and at one point they said, "You should join the glee club at Horace Mann." And at that point I had very little experience in classical music or choral music, but I remember immediately that I really loved it. My first experience performing a spiritual was also at Horace Mann. The first one that I remember really falling in love with was Little Lamb, Little Innocent Lamb. We loved singing that arrangement by Marshall Bartholomew, who was a past director of the Yale Glee Club. I recall that we almost viewed the pieces as joyful pieces. You know, they're kind of upbeat, they're very rhythmic, and we loved singing them for that reason, is sort of the way I remember it. I regret that we didn't talk about the text and what it meant, but I don't want to belittle those experiences because they gave us the experiences with that music that at least piqued our interest and made, I think, all of us curious to find out more about that music. And here I am later in life now leading a project that is going to delve much deeper into these works. I'm not sure that I would have the passion for it that I do now if I hadn't had those early experiences.
Effie Gardner, my teacher, taught us spirituals. Dawson's arrangement of Mary Had a Baby was the first one I remember. Of course, then I realized some of the songs we had been singing at our church were spirituals too. You know, we were in a lot of competitions as a high school choir, so there would be requirements, for each choir to learn certain kinds of music. You had to do some foreign language, you had to do spirituals. So when we would go to the festivals, each group would have to sing, all those different types of music. So we heard a lot of the Tuskegee type of arrangements.
Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom.
My earliest memory of a spiritual was not even realizing that it was a spiritual. Back during the 60s, my parents were very involved in the civil rights era. Albert and Clara Spencer. And when I thought back, one of the songs that was prominent at that time was "Oh Freedom." The March on Washington song back in 1963, is essentially saying that I'd rather die as opposed to being a slave and give myself to the Lord to be free. And so for me, looking back, "Oh Freedom" is the first spiritual song that I really can relate to and recall that was a spiritual, even though at that time in my life, I didn't know it was a spiritual selection.
I remember hearing my first spiritual at church camp, intimate campfire, singing around. I didn't know the words, but I knew the tunes, and I sang along as best as I could. This is the same church camp where on talent night, 4 white boys put on blackface and performed as the Ink Spots. It was very confusing because church was an authority when I was growing up, as were my parents, who held their own racist ideas. So you have these parents who are taking you to church, and you're learning in church. God loves all of us as we are, and yet you go home and hear racist ideas from the same people who take you to church every Sunday.
I have very vivid memories of where I lived in Portsmouth to actually hear the Ku Klux Klans during that time on their bullhorns making certain statements relative to the African American community, even cross burnings. My parents chose to send me to a white elementary school, Academy Park Elementary School. I would walk through the black neighborhood to the white neighborhood to go to Academy Park. And I do remember to this day that one of the times when I came home from school, a person actually came out of their house with a shotgun, and a group of black kids that were walking home, we were actually being shot at, wood actually splintering off of the telephone poles.
When I was 11, my siblings and I were bused across town to a school in an African American community. And honestly, I was scared because I didn't know that these kids were angry. I remember being threatened with, "Oh, I'm going to beat you up." And I was scared. And yet, they were probably scared too. They probably weren't angry. They were probably scared.
I also remember when desegregation came in 1968 and the schools were desegregated. Seemed like our environment became very much more restricted. It almost felt like we were being policed. When I was in the 7th grade, we had basically the freedom to kind of do the things you would do in a typical junior high, middle high school. But when the school was desegregated for the 8th grade, all of a sudden now people are walking around with walkie-talkies in school. We never had that during that time. After high school, I went to Howard University, a historical black college, and realized I was relaxed.
Tell me why. Why the stars in the sky?
With my father's group, when I was young, I didn't think much about it. The fact that there were white and black members of that group, it seemed normal to me. It was only later that I realized that that was something very unique when he started that group. There were not interracial groups before his. There were white groups and black doo-wop groups. So as I got older, I realized how significant that was. But growing up, I thought, oh, that's perfectly normal. That's the way it should be. Like my father, for instance, really admires Chuck Berry. I think he was a major influence. And you could draw a line from that music back through blues.
Well, I think the value of the spiritual in today's society really is that it is part of our American story. So it's part of the tapestry of what makes America unique. And it's part of our sort of looking at our history with, real eyes. In some past situations, the idea was to sort of close your eyes and maybe pretend it wasn't there or don't look at the bad side of it. But at least now, there seems to be an openness to want to see the real story and hear it in a true sense of what occurred. And then to recognize that occurred and how we can move forward. Because it is the words of what happened, pleasant or not, it is what occurred.
What people can learn today from studying and singing black music is you're learning and understanding our perspective of going from slavery to where we are now. There's a story there. It's our story. To be able to convey this story, I would like to think that it helps us as Americans to understand our American culture. The story is unique. The way we sing it is unique. We sing it that way because there is certain pain that's within us that needs to be expressed.
But then when you look at the other side of it, you're looking at how a group of folks that were struggling with that actually produced something that was a positive result or something that became something to create hope in folks. And that's certainly relevant for today. We're in a situation now that's not so good. So you want to say, well, how do you look past this to something, that could become better? And again, those stories of the spirituals are exactly that.
When I went to college and I went to conservatory, I had teachers that really taught me to begin with the text. I had a teacher in graduate school that said, don't even start to learn the notes until you've really looked at the text. And I've tried to bring those lessons into my choral conducting. I feel that there are many of us in our field, and myself included, that may not do as much of that initial research when we're doing music from other traditions, and we really should. And that's what I really want to accomplish with this project. I go back to the texts for Ain't It That Good News and see that, yeah, it sounds joyous, but it sounds joyous because it's looking past the struggles of life on earth and looking to a better place, looking to the kingdom of heaven. That added perspective, I think, gives more depth to your musical performance. And I think it's really important to think about the fact that these are songs that came out of slavery, a very difficult, a very sordid part of our history, but one that we have to grapple with.
Black music is American music. It is uniquely American. It is beautiful. It's angry. It's sorrowful. Only through accepting those feelings, those words, those notes as truth can we reconcile and heal and move forward. And as we move forward, as we spread the joy and the sadness and the anguish of this music, can we say, we are all the same. Now let's create new music. Maybe it's time to do something. Maybe it's time to use your voice. Maybe it's time to stand next to a black alto too and say, I never heard this song before today. I feel vulnerable. But if you're willing to stand here with me, I will sing this to our world and to our God as beautifully as I can sing it and with my heart.
I am 64 years old, so I have lived through quite a bit. I've seen quite a bit. The healing has to start somewhere. We have to get beyond the words. We have to do the action. To have people like yourself that are willing to say, let's sit down and have this conversation. That's all we've been asking for. Let's sit down and have this conversation. And from the conversation, how can we take what we discuss in the conversation and turn it to action?
I think it's really exciting that this is a topic now that is of such interest to so many people in America. I mean, I think it's a real push to want to get to the story, and we feel, I think, safe enough with each other to be vulnerable. It's not going to be always that natural from the very beginning, and you're going to want to fix things and, be politically correct and all of those kinds of things, and all those are great, attributes. But I think sometimes the emotion might hit you in a very raw way when you hear how people were treated at a certain time. And then at the same token, if you go to perform it, there are going to be some people that might think that you shouldn't be performing it. I mean, you really have to kind of put yourself on a limb. But by going out there, you're saying, I feel strong enough in my belief of what I'm doing that I'm going to make this statement, and I'm going to hope that you will understand it and not criticize me for being vulnerable to this.
So I have faith. I'm a Christian. I trust God. I trust what He's going to do. And so I got hope. I'm keeping hope alive. This can only get better. And so I'm all in.
Jesus walked this lonesome valley. He had to walk it by himself. Oh, nobody else could walk it for him. Oh, he had to walk it by himself. I've got to stand it by myself. Jesus walked this lonesome valley. He had to walk it by himself. Oh, nobody else could walk it for him. Oh, he had to walk it by himself. By himself.
Little lamb, little innocent lamb, I'm gonna serve God till I die. Little lamb, little innocent lamb, I'm gonna serve God till I die. Hypocrite, hypocrite, tell you what he do. I'm gonna serve God till I die. He'll talk about me and he'll talk about you. I'm gonna serve God till I die. Little lamb, little innocent lamb, I'm gonna serve God till I die. Little lamb, little innocent lamb, I'm gonna serve God till I die. Devil, he's got a slippery shoe. I'm gonna serve God till I die. Now, if you don't mind, he's gonna slip it on you. I'm gonna serve God till I die. 'Cause there ain't no dying over there, no dying over there. In that heavenly land, there'll be joy, joy, joy. Just take one break from Satan's wall. I'm gonna serve God till I die. Satan's wall is gonna tumble and fall. I'm gonna serve God till I die. Little lamb, little innocent lamb, I'm gonna serve God till I die. Little lamb, little innocent lamb, I'm gonna serve God till I die. 'Cause there ain't no dying over there, no dying over in that heavenly land, in that heavenly land.